started with the headline, "Local woman found murdered. Killer still at large." I'd been scrolling through the news on my phone during a break between surgeries when it caught my eye. The article described the victim, Emily Hart, a 32-year-old real estate agent who lived alone in a quiet neighborhood on the west side of Clearwater Ridge. The details were sparse, but one line stood out. The injuries suggest a level of precision that points to someone with medical knowledge. I stared at the words, my stomach tightening. "Dr. Whitaker?" The nurse's voice snapped me out of my thoughts. "Or 3 is ready for you." I set my phone down and headed for the operating room, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. In surgery, my focus returned. The patient was a middle-aged man with a ruptured appendix, and as I worked, the familiar rhythm of the procedure steadied my nerves. But as I made the final suture, I couldn't stop thinking about the article. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment eating takeout, I read the article again. There was something about the case that felt off. The killer had removed certain organs from the victim. The report didn't specify which ones, but it was enough to set my mind racing. It wasn't just murder, it was surgical. The next morning, the hospital was buzzing with whispers about the killing. Clearwater Ridge wasn't a big city. People talked, and rumors spread fast. "Did you hear about that woman?" one of the nurses asked as I walked into the lounge. I nodded, grabbing a cup of coffee. "They think the guy's a doctor or something," she continued, lowering her voice. "Creepy, right?" I didn't respond, but as I walked to the OR, I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes in the hallway lingered on me just a little too long. By the end of the week, another body was found. This time, it was a 28-year-old teacher named Rachel Miller, killed in her home. The injuries were eerily similar. Clean, precise cuts, organs removed. The police still had no leads, and Clearwater Ridge was on edge. That night, I stayed late at the hospital, catching up on paperwork. The halls were quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. As I worked, I noticed a shadow move across the frosted glass of my office door. I glanced up, my pulse quickening. "Hello!" There was no response. I stood and opened the door, peering into the dimly lit hallway. It was empty. I closed the door, locking it this time, and sat back down. But I couldn't focus. Something about the murders gnawed at me, a sense of familiarity I couldn't explain. I decided to look into the cases myself. Over the next few days, I scoured local news sites, piecing together what little information was available. The victims didn't seem connected, different ages, backgrounds, and social circles. But the method was consistent, almost ritualistic. And then there was the detail that made my blood run cold. The surgical instruments used in the killings weren't just standard. They were specialized, the kind of tools you'd only find in an advanced operating room. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Whoever was doing this wasn't just a doctor. They were a surgeon. And with each new detail, I started to realize something terrifying. The killer wasn't just targeting strangers. They were sending a message. The hospital felt different now. Every hallway, every locked door, every passing glance carried a weight I couldn't ignore. The murders weren't just news anymore. They were personal. I couldn't explain why, but I felt it deep in my gut. The whispers among the staff grew louder with each passing day. 2 murders in 1 week had turned Clearwater Ridge into a town on edge. The local news called the killer the Scalpel, a name that made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on my work, but every time I stepped into the OR, I felt eyes on me. "Dr. Whitaker, are you okay?" The question startled me. I looked up to see Nina, one of the senior nurses, watching me carefully. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. But I wasn't. That evening, as I scrubbed out after surgery, Nina cornered me in the locker room. "You've been distracted lately?" she said, crossing her arms. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated, debating whether to say anything. But before I could respond, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know they're looking into the staff, right?" I froze. "What do you mean?" "Police came by this morning," she said, glancing toward the door. "They're asking questions about the murders." specifically about surgeons. The air felt heavier, the walls of the locker room closing in around me. Why surgeons? I asked, my voice barely audible. She raised an eyebrow. Come on, Grant. You've seen the reports. Who else would have the skill to do that? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my desk, poring over the details of the murders again. The cuts were precise, the organs removed with surgical expertise. But why? Why would anyone go to such lengths? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. And then, as I stared at the screen, I noticed something I'd missed before. Both victims had been admitted to Clearwater Ridge Medical Center within the past year. Both had undergone minor surgeries. Both had been patients in my operating room. I felt a chill run down my spine. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital early, my stomach churning with unease. I needed to know if there was a connection between the victims and the hospital or me. I started digging through patient records, my fingers trembling as I typed each name into the system. Emily Hart, admitted for an appendectomy 6 months ago. Rachel Miller, gallbladder removal 8 months ago. My heart sank as I stared at the screen. I'd been the attending surgeon for both procedures. Was it a coincidence? Or was someone using my work as a blueprint? The thought made my stomach churn. I closed the files and leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Looking for something? The voice made me jump. I turned to see Dr. Caldwell, the hospital's chief of surgery, standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Just catching up on some paperwork, I said, forcing a smile. Caldwell stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You've been asking a lot of questions lately, Grant, he said, his voice calm but firm. Care to tell me why? For a moment, I considered telling him everything. But something about his tone stopped me. Just curious about the cases, I said, keeping my voice steady. They're hard to ignore. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he turned to leave. Be careful, Grant, he said over his shoulder. Curiosity can be dangerous. That night, I stayed late at the hospital, my nerves frayed. The halls were quiet, the faint hum of machines the only sound. As I walked to the parking lot, I felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The lot was empty, the rows of cars casting long shadows. But as I reached my car, I noticed something on the windshield. A note. It was folded neatly, the edges crisp. My hands shook as I opened it, my breath catching in my throat. The message was written in bold, precise handwriting. You're next. I scanned the lot again, my heart pounding. The killer wasn't just targeting strangers anymore. They were coming for me. The note burned in my hand. The words seared into my mind. You're next. I scanned the parking lot again, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The shadows felt alive, shifting with every flicker of the streetlights. I climbed into my car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Whoever left the note wanted me to know they were watching, and they wanted me to be afraid. By the time I got home, it was past midnight. The silence in my apartment was oppressive, the kind of quiet that makes every sound feel deafening. I checked all the locks, closed the curtains, and poured myself a stiff drink. But no amount of alcohol could dull the sense of dread crawling up my spine. I sat at my desk, staring at the note. The handwriting was precise, almost surgical in its neatness. It wasn't hurried or panicked. It was methodical. I turned it over in my hands, searching for anything I might have missed. That's when I noticed the faint smudge in the corner. A dark stain that looked like dried blood. Whoever wrote this wasn't just threatening me. They were taunting me. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital early, the note tucked into my jacket pocket. I needed to figure out who was behind this. The security office was small and cluttered, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. I handed the note to Officer Briggs, the hospital's head of security, and explained what had happened. Briggs frowned, his thick mustache twitching as he studied the paper. This is serious, he said finally. I'll check the parking lot cameras and see if we can get a look at who left it. I nodded, relief washing over me. Thank you. But Briggs's expression remained grim. Until we figure this out, you should be careful, Dr. Whitaker. Whoever this is, they know where you are. His words stayed with me throughout the day. Every step down the hall felt heavier, every glance from a colleague sharper. That afternoon, Briggs called me back to the security office. We reviewed the footage, he said, motioning for me to sit. The screen showed the hospital parking lot, the timestamp marking the early hours of the morning. The camera was positioned near the entrance, giving a clear view of my car. First, nothing seemed unusual. But then, around 3:15 a.m., a figure appeared. They were wearing a hoodie, the shadows obscuring their face. The person moved quickly, pulling the note from their pocket and placing it under my windshield wiper before disappearing into the darkness. Can you zoom in? I asked, my voice tight. Briggs shook his head. Too blurry. But I'll keep digging. I left the office feeling no closer to the truth. Whoever this was, they were careful, deliberate. That evening, I went back to the patient files. There had to be something I was missing, some connection I hadn't seen before. I reviewed Emily Hart's record again, then Rachel Miller's. Both women had been patients of mine. Both had undergone routine surgeries with no complications. But as I compared the two files, a detail jumped out at me. Both women had follow-up appointments with Dr. Alan Coyle, a general practitioner who worked out of a small office near the hospital. Coyle was well liked by the staff, known for his easygoing demeanor and sharp sense of humor. But I couldn't ignore the coincidence. I decided to pay him a visit the next day. Coyle's office was quiet when I arrived, the waiting room empty. The receptionist smiled as I walked in. Dr. Whitaker, are you here to see Dr. Coyle? I nodded, forcing a smile. I just have a quick question for him. She motioned toward the back. He's in his office. Go on in. I found Coyle sitting at his desk, flipping through a patient chart. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up in recognition. Grant, what brings you here? I closed the door behind me, my heart pounding. I need to ask you about Emily Hart and Rachel Miller, I said, my voice steady. Coyle's smile faltered. What about them? They were both your patients after their surgeries, I said, watching his reaction closely. Did you notice anything unusual during their follow-ups? He frowned, leaning back in his chair. Not really. They both seemed fine, healing well, no complications. Did they mention anything? Anyone following them? Anything strange? Coyle shook his head. No, nothing like that. Why are you asking? I hesitated, debating how much to tell him. But before I could answer, his phone buzzed. Sorry, I need to take this, he said, reaching for the receiver. I nodded, stepping out of the office. But as I walked back through the waiting room, something caught my eye. On the receptionist's desk was a stack of medical forms. The top one had a faint smudge in the corner, a dark stain that looked exactly like the one on the note. My heart sank as I stared at the stain. I wasn't sure who I could trust anymore, and I was running out of time. The smudge on the form nagged at me, a familiar chill running down my spine. Could have been nothing, a spill, a mistake. But it wasn't. Couldn't be. I didn't say anything as I left Dr. Coyle's office, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. By the time I got home, the unease had settled deep in my chest. I locked the door, checked the windows, and sat at the kitchen table with the note in front of me. The handwriting, the stain, it all felt deliberate. Someone was playing a game and I was a piece on their board. But who? And why? The next day, I went back to the hospital, determined to find answers. I started with the patient logs for Emily Hart and Rachel Miller, cross-referencing every name and appointment. The deeper I dug, the clearer the pattern became. Both women had interacted with several of the same medical staff beyond me. Nurses, orderlies, lab techs. But one name stood out, Mark Talbot, a surgical tech who had assisted on both of their procedures. Talbot was quiet, almost invisible in the OR. He did his job well, never drawing attention to himself. But now, every memory of him felt tinged with unease. I pulled up his personnel file. There wasn't much basic info, a few notes about his work history. But one detail caught my eye. Before coming to Clearwater Ridge, Talbot had worked at a hospital in another state. That hospital had been shut down after a series of unexplained incidents, including the disappearance of 2 nurses. I printed out the file and brought it to Officer Briggs. "This is the guy," I said, sliding the papers across his desk. Briggs frowned, flipping through the pages. "You think Talbot's connected to the murders?" "I don't think," I said, my voice steady. "I know." Briggs nodded, his expression grim. "I'll look into it." That night, I stayed late at the hospital, keeping an eye on Talbot from a distance. He moved through the halls like a ghost, his presence barely noticeable. Around midnight, I saw him disappear into the supply room. I waited a few minutes before following, my pulse pounding. The room was dark, the faint hum of the refrigeration units the only sound. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. But then, in the corner, I noticed a cabinet slightly ajar. I opened it, the door creaking loudly in the silence. Inside were surgical tools, scalpels, clamps, forceps. All standard equipment. But these weren't clean. The edges were stained dark, the metallic smell of blood filling the air. My stomach turned as I stared at the tools, my mind racing. This wasn't just a supply room. It was a workshop. I heard a sound behind me, a soft creak, like someone shifting their weight. I turned, my flashlight catching the edge of a shadow as it disappeared around the corner. "Talbot," I called out, my voice shaking. No response. I stepped out into the hallway, the beam of my flashlight trembling. The air felt heavier, the silence deafening. Then I saw it. On the wall, written in smudged red letters, were the words, "You're too late." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The message was fresh, the streaks still wet. I ran back to the nurse's station, my heart pounding. But when I got there, the desk was empty. "Where's Nina?" I asked one of the orderlies, my voice frantic. "She went to check on a patient in room 24, he said. Room 24 was at the far end of the east wing, a quiet corner of the hospital that always felt isolated. I sprinted down the hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls. When I reached the room, the door was ajar. The lights inside flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. "Nina," I called out, pushing the door open. The bed was empty, the sheets neatly folded. But on the floor, in the center of the room, was a pair of blue scrubs. Bloodstained. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. This wasn't a coincidence. Talbot wasn't just a suspect. He was the killer. And now he was hunting inside the hospital. The blood-stained scrubs on the floor felt like a message. Talbot wasn't hiding anymore. He wanted me to know he was watching, that he was steps ahead. I stood frozen in the doorway of room 24, my mind racing. Was Nina alive? Had I just missed him? The sound of footsteps behind me snapped me back to reality. I spun around, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, only to see Officer Briggs jogging down the hall. "We got your call," he said, his hand hovering near his holster. "What's going on?" I pointed to the scrubs on the floor. "He's here. Talbot. He's targeting the staff now." Briggs frowned, stepping into the room to examine the scene. "He's escalating," he muttered. "Where's the rest of the staff?" "They're not safe," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to lock down the hospital." Briggs nodded, speaking into his radio. "Code Gray. Full lockdown. No one in or out." The announcement echoed through the hospital, the automated voice sending chills down my spine. I followed Briggs as he secured the doors and called for backup, my nerves fraying with every second. "What's Talbot's endgame?" Briggs asked as we moved through the halls, checking each room. "I don't know," I admitted. "But he's methodical. He's not just killing for the sake of it. He's sending a message." Briggs stopped, his eyes narrowing. "A message to who?" Before I could answer, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the hallway into darkness. "Backup generator should kick in," Briggs muttered. pulling out his flashlight. But it didn't. The hospital was silent except for the faint hum of emergency power keeping the life support machines running. "Stay close," Briggs said, his voice tense. "We'll sweep the east wing first." The hallways were eerie in the dim light, the shadows stretching and shifting with every step we took. Every sound, creaking pipes, distant footsteps, felt like a threat. When we reached the East Wing nurses' station, the scene stopped us cold. The walls were smeared with streaks of blood. The words "do no harm" scrawled across the glass in jagged letters. "Jesus," Briggs whispered, his flashlight trembling. On the floor was a surgical tray, its instruments neatly arranged but coated in blood. In the center of the tray was Nina's name tag. I gagged, turning away as Briggs spoke into his radio. "We need backup in the East Wing. Now." But the radio crackled, the response garbled and incomprehensible. "We're on our own," Briggs said, his jaw tightening. "Let's move." We continued down the hall, the tension suffocating. The farther we went, the colder the air grew, the metallic tang of blood thickening with every step. At the end of the hall was the supply room. The door was open, the faint sound of something metallic clinking inside. Briggs motioned for me to stay back as he approached, his gun drawn. "Nina?" he called out, pushing the door open. The room was dark, the shadows thick and oppressive. Briggs stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. I waited in the hallway, my pulse pounding, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then I heard it. A sharp, wet gurgle, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. "Briggs," I called out, stepping toward the door. There was no response. I grabbed a scalpel from a nearby tray and entered the room, my hands shaking. The beam of my flashlight landed on Briggs, lying on the floor in a pool of blood. His throat had been slit, the wound clean and precise. Above him, standing calmly with a scalpel in hand, was Talbot. "Dr. Whitaker," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "You've been looking for me." My breath caught in my throat as he stepped closer, his expression unnervingly calm. "Why?" I managed to whisper, gripping the scalpel tightly. "Why are you doing this?" Talbot tilted his head, the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. "Do you know what it feels like to be invisible?" he asked. "To spend your life in the background, unnoticed and unimportant?" I didn't answer. He gestured to the tray of instruments beside him. "But with these," he continued, his voice almost reverent, "I can make people notice. I can remind them who holds the power." My mind raced, searching for a way out. "You don't have to do this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can get you help." Talbot chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I don't need help, Dr. Whitaker. I've never been more in control." He lunged at me, the scalpel flashing in the dim light. I barely managed to dodge, the blade slicing through the sleeve of my scrubs. I swung my flashlight, catching him in the side of the head. He stumbled but recovered quickly, his movements precise and deliberate. We circled each other, the room feeling smaller with every step. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, my grip on the scalpel slippery with sweat. Talbot lunged again, and this time I struck first. The blade sank into his arm, and he let out a guttural growl, staggering back. But he didn't stop. He came at me with renewed fury, his scalpel slashing wildly. I blocked one strike but missed the second, the blade slicing across my shoulder. The pain was sharp and immediate, but adrenaline kept me moving. I grabbed the tray of instruments and hurled it at him, the tools clattering to the floor. Talbot slipped, giving me just enough time to run. I barreled into the hallway, shouting for help, but the hospital was eerily silent. Talbot followed, his footsteps echoing behind me. I reached the stairwell, slamming the door shut and bolting down the steps. When I reached the ground floor, the sound of distant sirens filled the air. Backup had finally arrived. Talbot didn't follow me out. The police found him later that night, unconscious in the supply room, a makeshift tourniquet tied around his arm. Talbot was taken into custody. His crimes splashed across every news outlet. The hospital tried to move on, but the scars remained, literal and figurative. I left Clearwater Ridge soon after, unable to shake the memories of that night. But even now, years later, I can still feel the weight of his gaze.